Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Theater here at the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. We're so glad to have you here. I'm Paul Kingsbury. I'm on staff here. I'll be your host for what promises to be a very interesting discussion about an influential musical movement that music journalist Geoffrey Himes believes was hiding in plain sight for years and went nameless. So he gave it a name. He calls it In-Law Country. It's a play, of course, on outlaw country, the musical movement that was led by Waylon and Willie and the Boys, and that was one that was widely recognized. Today we'll talk with Geoffrey, who's written a new book about the in-laws, and Rodney Crowell, the master songwriter and singer who is right in the middle of it all. A few words now about our distinguished guests here today. Last fall, the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum published a book that Geoffrey Himes has been researching and writing for several years. It's the subject of today's program. It's titled In-Law Country: How Emmylou Harris, Rosanne Cash, and Their Circle Fashioned a New Kind of Country Music, 1968 to 1985. The book's about the musical community that grew up around Emmylou Harris, Rosanne Cash, Rodney Crowell, and their collaborators and friends. Between 1968 and 85, that close-knit musical community blended traditional country that had become passé on country radio at the time with folk and rock innovations that had never been accepted on country radio. Through dozens of interviews, as well as in-depth research, Geoffrey Himes explores the lives and the enduring impact of this talented group of friends and collaborators. Geoffrey Himes has been writing about country music and many other forms of popular music since 1975 for many publications. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, the New York Times, No Depression, Downbeat, Paste, and other publications. His book on Bruce Springsteen, Born in the USA, was published by Continuum Press in their 33 1/3 series in 2005. Geoffrey's written liner notes for albums by Rosanne Cash, Merle Haggard, Marty Stewart, and many others. And coming up this year, he will publish his first book of poetry, and in the fall, he's going to have a book out on Willie Nelson. Rodney Crowell is, of course, one of the most versatile and eloquent artists in country music. As a songwriter, he's written such timeless works as Till I Gain Control Again, Ain't Living Long Like This, Leaving Louisiana in the Broad Daylight, Making Memories of Us, Song for the Life, Shame on the Moon, Please Remember Me, and many, many more. And his songs have been cut by a few people you may have heard of: Willie Nelson, Johnny Cash, Bob Seger, Crystal Gale, Tanya Tucker, Waylon Jennings, and on and on and on. And of course, Rosanne Cash and Emmylou Harris. Rodney's also a Grammy-winning recording artist with more than 20 studio albums to his credit, including the classic Diamonds and Dirt, which was the first country album to ever have 5 #1 country singles. Rodney's the author of 2 books, Chinaberry Sidewalks, a memoir, and Word for Word, a collection of his song lyrics with stories behind the songs. Rodney also figures as a major character in this book we're going to talk about today, because he was in Emmylou Harris's hot band during its formative years and worked closely with Rosanne Cash when the two of them were married, and he provided her with songs and produced several of her records. We thought Rodney might shed some good light on the history that Geoffrey Himes has written about here. So without further ado, let's please welcome Rodney Crowell and Geoffrey Himes. Just for fun, I thought before we start our conversation, to set the mood, we would watch a video from 1976 from the Old Gray Whistle show that the BBC did of you in Emmylou Harris's hot band doing your song Amarillo. So let's cue that one up.
Amarillo is also a town in Texas, which is a state in the United States. And even though I wrote the song with my friend, Rodney Crowell, it's not autobiographical because neither of us have ever been in such a terrible situation as to lose someone we love to a jukebox and a pinball machine, which is what the song is about, believe it or not.
Rodney, I'm curious what memories that clip brings back for you.
Well, usually Emmy had her glasses on top of her head and couldn't remember where they were. So as I was watching her sing, and well, that was a little inside joke with everybody in the band. It's like Emmy was always looking for her glasses, and you looked on top of your head. But God, she was so on, wasn't she?
Well, and the whole band,
Yeah.
just run down for us who was in that band at that time. Who were we seeing on stage?
Glendy Harden, piano, Emery Gordy, bass, myself, Hank DeVito, steel guitar, James Burton, electric guitar.
Is it John Ware?
John Ware.
On drums?
Yeah.
What a band.
It was interesting about that band because Glendy and Emery and James were in Elvis's TCB band, and they were juggling dates. When they weren't with Elvis, they were playing with us. And so John and Hank and I, we were the hippies. So there was like and ne'er the twain shall meet.
Somehow,
except Glenn D. He became a hippie.
and somehow something great came out of it. I'm curious, Geoffrey, for you, when you see a clip like that, what does that bring to mind for you?
My God, they're so young. Yeah, I mean, that sort of captures a lot of what I'm talking about in the book, that there was this, it was definitely country music, and there's no question about that, but it was somehow different from everything that had come from before. It was, it wasn't like the urban cowboy stuff that had just been happening. It wasn't the California rock of the Burritos and Poco and the Eagles. It wasn't sort of countrypolitan. It wasn't outlaw music. It was something new under the sun. And what my book is about is the fact that there was this new kind of country music that emerged in the mid-'70s, thanks in large part to Emmy. And at first it was just her career that was that sound, but then when Rodney and Rosanne and other people Ricky started having their own careers, the sound sort of spread, and it really became a movement because everybody were either married to each other or worked with each other or wrote songs for each other. It was a very cohesive movement.
How did you come to identify it as a movement? What was it that spoke to you that said this is all part of the same thing?
Well, when you hear the sound of the music is different and it had a lot in common. And then as you start interviewing the musicians and learning about them, you realize about all these ties that I was talking about, so that Emmylou Harris and her producer Brian Ahern, during that opening string of great records, were married, and Rodney and Rosanne were married for a good while. Sharon White and Ricky Skaggs were married. Guy Clark and Susanna Clark, who were both great songwriters, were married. Guy and Susanna and Townes Van Zandt were best friends. Emery Gordy, who was in this band, ended up being an important producer and songwriter. So there's all these ties, and you realize, oh, this is, Rosanne once told me, yeah, it's so Shakespearean, all these ties to each other. So that sort of clues you in that it's not accidental that all these records sound similar, not alike, but have a lot in common.
Rodney, how does that strike you to hear that this was a movement hiding in plain sight that nobody had named until Geoffrey says?
For me, that sound that you're talking about started with Graham Parsons, with Grievous Angel. And it was Glenn and James. And Emmylou was, I think, Emmy always told me that she learned so much about country. Emmy was a folk singer, but she learned about country music and country songs singing duets with Graham. And Graham was the one that turned her on to the Louvin brothers, that sibling harmony. And when Emmy and I got together early on, after Graham passed away, we sat down and started singing Louvin brothers songs together and singing them as a duet. But probably the thing that happened that was the kernel of that sound that you're talking about was when Mary Martin signed Emmylou to Warner Brothers. She was from Toronto, so she knew Brian Ahern. And it just so happened at that particular time, Brian had the Enactron truck, which was a control room in a tractor trailer part of a tractor.
Essentially a mobile way of recording.
It was a mobile recording studio. So he was, at the time that he and Emmy got together to start making records together, he was moving the Enactron truck to Los Angeles. And that's where the band was. And so that group of musicians, really starting with James and Glenn D. and Emery.
And did you feel like Mary Martin basically was saying, to Emmy, hey, you really need to see if you can hook up with Brian Ahern to produce you, because he's doing this great stuff with Anne Murray, and this is a really talented guy.
Yeah, but mind you, Brian's records that he made in Toronto were not particularly country, and it was that's why I point to Graham Parsons, because he introduced the purity of the country song and the two voices that Brian was smart enough to amplify. And
So in the book, I talk a lot about, the Byrds and Sweetheart of the Rodeo, and how that, helped bring, rock and roll and country together, even though country had always been there since Jerry Lee and Elvis, but, it sort of brought it back together in a productive way. And, how Emmylou encountered this when Rick Roberts and Chris Hillman heard her singing in a club next to the Cellar Door in Washington and said, this is really amazing, and Graham, you should hear this. And so that's how the connection was made. But to me, what's interesting is that the records that Emmy first made for Warner's, which was Pieces of the Sky and Elite Hotel, they sounded, to my ears, very different from those Graham records, especially the Burrito and Poco records. There was, Graham was a great singer and songwriter, but he did not have Emmy's discipline, I think. And that Brian, and those California rock records had that sort of loose, raw feel of rock and roll records. And they're trying to be the Rolling Stones and George Jones at the same time. And, and there was a lot of distractions, shall we say. And Emmy, I think, was much more focused on what she wanted to do. And Brian wasn't part of that California scene, so he was bringing a fresh perspective. And what he told me was that, he learned how to make records with Anne, but at a certain point it became repetitive, and he wanted to try something more ambitious. And so he leaped at this chance, this invitation from Mary to work with this unknown singer at the time. And that he brought his ideas about, how you make a record with him. And it was the meeting of Emmy coming out of the Graham world and Brian with his own sort of unique vision of, how you make records that are very clear. And it was that combination that allowed these records to work on country radio in a way that the records by Graham and the Eagles and Poco didn't, that Emmy wanted to be on country radio because she was, a Southern girl and wanted to reach that Southern audience, I think.
What do you think about Geoffrey's idea there? Do you think that holds water?
I think what you were just saying, what it made me think is that, the California country-ish stuff, including Graham, was not particularly produced. It was performed and with some sprawl, but Brian produced. So it could be said that Brian was the first kind of West Coast Canadian, moved to West Coast, who started producing country. We never would go with country rock. We thought as we talked about the music we made, it seemed like, well, no, we play country music, we play rock and roll. We don't just play country rock. But now I'm realizing that it's like Brian was the producer. He produced my first record, and it was very produced.
Rodney, did you feel like at the time, in the 70s, going into the 80s, did you feel like you guys were doing something distinctly different from the country music that had come before? Were you trying to distinguish yourself from them?
I laugh because we did some shows with Conway Twitty. His drummer, Pork Chop. Most people knows about Pork Chop, and he would come into our dressing room and he'd look at us and he'd say, "Y'all aren't country. You're just pretending to be." I said, "I come from sharecrop farmers. I'm as country as it can get," And he said, No, your hair's too. So, I mean, we did feel, I think if I'm honest, we knew we were onto something, but it was sort of instilled in, and Emmy and I shared, we were both Townes Van Zandt fans, and Guy Clark was really my good friend. And one thing Emmylou and I shared as our friendship developed was sort of don't get above your raisin. It's like, to do good work, you can't go getting your ego all up and involved in it. So to really think that we were doing something beyond would lead to self-consciousness. And I've always thought that self-consciousness is the enemy of art. So pretty much, I would think, and mind you, at that time, we were smoking a lot of grass, and so we were pretty unconscious to start with. So it's hard to become self-conscious when you're unconscious.
But even so, I mean, for somebody like you who grew up in blue-collar Houston, but you also grew up listening to Bob Dylan and the Beatles, so you're not like your father's. You know, your version of music was not your father's version of music. And it seems like you, in both your songwriting and your performing, you brought both aspects of your background to the table. Is that fair?
That's very true, and especially Rosanne and I, when we started working together and making records, we were very consciously aware that my father was a local country singer, but with a really deep repertoire of songs. I heard so many great country songs. Rosanne's father was world famous, and we were Beatles fans. So, and we really consciously were aware that as we tried to meld our coming of age with the Beatles so prevalent, and later, and Dylan, shortly behind that, with essentially late 40s through early 60s country music, fusing those things together, that was the sound that we did conjure up, and we were conscious of that.
Did you actually ever talk among yourselves like, yeah, we're taking some of this Beatles stuff, we're taking some of this Dylan influence, and we're putting it together with country music? Did you ever have those conversations?
It wasn't so much the conversation ahead, but we would be in the studio, and in the moment of making records, we might make a reference. Oh, that sounds like, something might come from mid-'60s Beatles, or take your pick. So it wasn't like we set out consciously to merge the two, but later on, it's like you listen to 7 Year Ache, that record is like, I mean, that's the Ronettes, Be My Baby, and which led to the Beatles, you take Be My Baby. And so after it was said and done, we said, oh, wow, we just remade Be My Baby.
But it's like, what I think is that it was not so much that you self-consciously set out to create this kind of music, but in the act of being true to yourself, it inevitably happened. Is that?
Yeah, that's well put.
Geoffrey, I wanted to ask you, one thing that you talk about that was a key part of this movement was writing songs that dealt with relationships between men and women in a more modern way than had happened in country music earlier. Tell us more about how In-Laws country songs differed from traditional country.
So I remember one of the first interviews I did with Rosanne, I think it was in 1983 when I met you, that she said that when she grew up, she didn't really listen to country music, not unlike you. And she listened to her dad, but that was her dad, and that was a separate category. But she listened to Tom Petty and Fleetwood Mac and the Beatles. And then when she got into her 20s and she had her heart broken, she said, I locked myself in my car and listened to country songs all day. And she said, I realized that, rock and roll is dating music. it's like your first or second relationship. And that country music is adult music. It's like, when you're trying to like keep your marriage together, or, keep your drinking habits under control, pay the bills, and those kind of things. And that country music has always been marriage music in a sense, as opposed to dating music. And I started thinking about what she said, and I said, well, this generation, the baby boomer generation that all three of us and all these, Rosanne and Emmy and everybody had different kinds of marriages. That there was no longer an assumption that the husband was the boss and that there was a bunch of set rules that you followed, but that it was something that you negotiated so that both parties were satisfied and that both parties could have careers and take care of the children and make it work. And there wasn't really a model for that because it was kind of a newish idea, and there wasn't a music for it. And so my thought was that this is a new kind of marriage music for a new kind of marriage.
How does that strike you?
Did she tell you who broke her heart?
Yeah, it was Randy Scruggs.
Randy Scruggs. Yeah. Sweet Randy Scruggs. Sweetest guy in the world broke her heart. Can you believe that?
I don't think Randy was aware he was doing it necessarily, but.
So what do you think about Geoffrey's concept that you guys were doing a sort of a more mature, more realistic take on relationships between men and women?
Well, yeah, it was, Rosanne was ahead of her time. Rosanne had lived in London, and Rosanne was more worldly than I was. I wasn't that long out of Texas. And so I learned a lot from Rosanne, and part of being in a relationship with her was that, this is an equal partnership. There's no dominant human being in this. That we're in a partnership, romantic partnership, creative partnership. And she was smart, and I had to catch up. And I was really grateful for that. I mean, consciously grateful that I was lucky enough to be with a woman who pretty much demanded that I step up intellectually as well as emotionally. And that was a gift to me.
Do you think it affected your songwriting?
Yes, it did, but the one thing that for me, I developed as a songwriter well ahead of everything else that I've lived into. By the time I was 22, I was writing songs that are still around. And so it was, and I was writing those songs, but I hadn't grown into enough of a mature human being to own the gift to use it constantly. The songs would come and I'd get them down, but how to make a career out of it, I was just feeling around in the dark, painting by numbers.
What fascinated me about this group of people is that they're writing songs about this new kind of marriage that I'm talking about. And they were using their own marriages sort of as the raw material to work on. And that's why I chose this term for the book and the movement was in-law country, because there is that sort of family connections. And it's obviously a pun on outlaw country, but I think there's something more to it than that, and that, these are all couples that have both members have, vital creative careers and are intelligent people, and they're both, unlike outlaw country, which is sort of the loner male, mythology, ethos. These are songs about trying to stay together, even though it's not easy, So, and I thought, I'll say this too. part of the reason I wanted to write this book was I thought this movement was an important part of country music that's never gotten its due. And I always thought that part of the problem was it didn't have a catchy name, like bluegrass or outlaw country or urban cowboy or bro country or whatever. So
What took you so long? We could have used you.
I'll say, Rodney, you mentioned something back in the green room that I thought was really interesting. You agree with Geoffrey that it was a movement, but that it didn't. You said something interesting about why you think it didn't get identified as such, right?
Well, the movement didn't produce a superstar. We were working artists, but Emmylou is, to this day, you don't really classify Emmylou as a superstar. Perhaps when Vince Gill first came along, he was 19 years old. We were, 7, 8 years ahead of Vince. So had he been, I think if Vince had been there early and been part of that thing, he would have been the superstar. And which would have probably drawn more to it. Now, Ricky Skaggs came out of that creative, and he became a bona fide star in country music. But Ricky was a musician, recording artist, and he wasn't Ricky. I never related to Ricky as a songwriter, performer. And one of the things about Rosanne and myself and Guy Clark and Emmylou, we all thought of ourselves as songwriters first, and recording artists next. Even Emmy, although she would say, "Yeah, well, I don't write much," but when she did, it was always good stuff. And I really think that Guy Clark he made an impression on all of us, and Guy was the one he was kind of curator of this evolution, songwriting evolution, and he would say to me, he said, "Look," he said, "you got a lot of talent." He said, "You can be a star or you can be an artist. Pick one." Of course, I wanted to please him, and I said, "I want to be an artist." And that mindset of like, to be an artist is to follow that creative thing right down to wherever it goes. It's not the same broad stroke thing that the public out there recognizes. That's what you call commercial.
But at the same time, what's remarkable about this movement, to my mind, is that you had hits. These were like high quality songs, sort of innovative recording techniques, and they were like hits on country radio. That seems so implausible today.
But see, I think the outlaw movement is, we have to take our hats off to it, because Waylon and Willie and John, they all knew how to create on that level that we're talking about, and at the same time raise up another 5 or 8 notches to where the public recognized these are charismatic stars. And I for one, think I never really had a feel for that. Mm-hmm. And I'm okay with that. It's just like, how do you be a star? Well, you write good songs, right? No. There's something about the public out there, they have to relate to you in a way where that you live in their house with them. And it just didn't happen with this particular group. As far as, certainly there were a lot of hit records, a lot of really great records, but it didn't seem like any of us went and lived in anybody's house out there where yeah, "Oh yeah, we know you. We're going to give you some money."
Geoffrey does a very good job, I think, in this book of showing what you were talking about earlier, Rodney, that really outstanding songwriters like Townes Van Zandt and Guy Clark were your shining lights. Were shining lights for you guys. And Geoffrey, how were you positioning those types of songwriters with folks like Rodney and Rosanne? How did you see it as you were writing this book?
Well, both Rodney and Steve Earle have told me that, going to those parties at Guy and Susanna's house, and often Towns was in attendance, were crucial because nobody was well known at this point. They're all sort of scraping by to make a living, but that's what you were just talking about. Guy and Towns had a very high standard of what was a good song, and sort of were very blunt about expressing that. And that when you guys got recording contracts and a little bit of traction, that standard was always in your head. And maybe it limited you from becoming a star because you weren't willing to sacrifice that, or maybe it was essential to the careers that you had. But I think that, having that standard in your head that you were aiming at, in addition to whatever, career considerations you had to cope with, it made you different from a lot of other people. Is that fair?
Well, I had 15 minutes of fame for a couple of minutes, and I think the standard for writing really good songs was a contributing factor because, when you get on the radio and you walk into a room and people look at you and they project this image they have on you as you walk in. And I noticed that when I would walk into a room during that small window in my career, that I started trying to take on a persona that I thought was being projected on me. And at some point, it dawned on me, if I keep doing this, if I keep trying to create this persona that's being projected on me because I'm on the radio and I'm recognizing, then I'm not going to be the guy who created that music in the first place. The true artist who created that music is going to be something else that is made up. And I remember very consciously starting to deconstruct that. And I took some years away. I mean, this is beyond the time of your book, so forgive me. But it may be relevant to what we're talking about.
I should point out that this book covers 1968 to 85, and that's because my manuscript was too large. So
Yeah, it was over 500,000 words.
there's a second volume that's basically done. That hopefully, if you guys all buy lots of books, copies of this book will come out in probably 2026 maybe, and it will deal with this period that Rodney's talking about now, I think.
Yeah. But to take it back to songs and music, if you realize that Emmylou was doing Louvin Brothers songs and Lennon McCartney songs on the same record. And in fact, Rosanne and I did the first cover of a Beatles song that ever made it #1 on the country charts.
I don't want to spoil the party.
I don't want to spoil the party. And we were excited about that. We thought, wow, that's something to do. Forget the point that I was making.
Talk a little bit about those early days in the Enactron truck in California, and when you're making those, Pieces of the Sky and Elite Hotel, which both came out in 1975, and how Brian was able to create that sound where you could hear the acoustic instruments as well as the electric instruments. You had a real tight rhythm section, but didn't obscure the lyrics. And how did he achieve that kind of clarity, and how did that end up influencing your own production philosophy?
Yeah, well, good microphones. First of all, I had good mic preamps and a Neve console inside. It's like having a good sound system and to record to. But it was also the way the musicians played, and they played to the vision that Brian had Brian had a sonic vision, and he was a magician in that you could understand the sonic vision that he had and play toward it. So when you go in and listen back, if you needed to change anything about what you were doing to continue to help him create what he had in mind, it was pretty easy to spot. It was good engineering, and it was analog tape. So it was, but mind you, it was in an old, it was up in Coldwater Canyon, and this truck was parked in way up a hill in front of like a ranch-style mansion that was a brothel in the 40s.
And this is where Emmylou and Brian were living at the time.
Emmylou and Brian were living there. I remember the first day I arrived in Los Angeles, Emmy came through Austin, where I was living at the time, and I sat in with her at the Armadillo World, and these were the days she said, "Hey, I'm going to LA tomorrow. You want to go?" And I said, she said, "I got an extra ticket." So I moved to LA on somebody else's ticket. I don't even know who it was. But when I got there up in Coldwater Canyon that day, we arrived, Patty Davis and Bernie Ledden and John Hartford and Rick Kuna and God, a whole Bob Hunka, all of these people were eating chili at the table. And I'm thinking, well, I've arrived at the right place here, you know. And it was that kind of creative culture that was going on. And Brian he focused it. And then when I started producing records, no doubt, everything that I brought to those early Rosanne records, I learned in the sessions, Emmylou sessions with Brian.
Were there specific techniques or things that you learned from Brian? You said, we're doing it this way because it worked with Brian and Emmylou. Or was it just kind of a gestalt, a feel?
It was intuitive. It was truly intuitive. And it's when a really good band gets together and starts playing and it becomes unconscious and it's nobody has to think about playing, that's when a band gets really good and can play unconsciously. So the creative atmosphere and actually the function of making records had evolved to the place where whenever we walked into, when we all drove up the hill to record at the Enactron truck, there was already a mindset or a vibe, and we plugged in and recorded music very unconsciously. Now, of course, at some point, it's like the mind is a good editing tool, but it's the heart that gives us the best art. So in the process of learning how to make records with Brian, it was like we just go with our hearts and do this, but at some particular point when you got to start changing something or editing something to make it, to give it the form it needed, that was really the only time our brains kicked in. The rest of the time we were just going on instinct. And
one of the things in football, people talk about coaching trees, somebody was an assistant to, Andy Reid, and he becomes head coach over here, and there was in this movement, there was like a production tree, so that you worked with Brian, and when Ricky took your place, he worked with Brian, and Tony Brown worked under Brian, and Emery, and you all became sort of important producers making records, and that's what sort of reinforces my argument that this is a cohesive movement, because there was that threading sort of thing. And when I wrote the book, I didn't want to make a book about just lyrics, which is the temptation of all writers. But I wanted to give due consideration to the music as well. And that's why Brian plays a large part. There's a chapter on Clarence White. There's a chapter on Ralph Stanley, and when he hired Ricky and Keith Whitley. And Ricky, as you say, wasn't a songwriter the way the rest of you were, but he was important to that. Another important influence in this movement, which was those bluegrass instruments and that bluegrass feeling of, fiddles, mandolins, acoustic guitars, and how they could work in with our actual rock and roll rhythm section.
That's true.
And I think those, and Clarence, of course, started out as a bluegrass musician and then morphed into a Bakersfield kind of musician and then joined the Byrds. And so I think that those musical aspects of the movement shouldn't be underestimated.
You made me think of something there, and the community, certainly on those first 3 Rosanne records that we made, Hank DeVito and Emery Gordy never left the studio. Everything they were standing by, so in truth, they should have been co-producers on those records because their creative input was constant. And they were so much help. And Emery and Hank, if you watch this, I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask, we were talking earlier about were there conscious things that you were trying to do in the studio in writing these songs to make them different from the country music that came before, but I just wonder, with you producing Rosanne's albums, you knew what was on country radio at the time, certainly the early 80s. Were you trying to distinguish her in any way in terms of her sound, the production that you were doing with her from what you were hearing on the radio, or was it a matter of, we'll just go with what feels good?
In truth, we never thought of it that way. I heard what was on the radio like anybody would, but we didn't try to make music to fit into it. In fact, probably we were left to our own devices. We were making music that didn't fit in a way, but we got lucky. With good songs, 7 Year 8 was such a classic piece of writing. And I remember when she first played that song with Guy Clark and I in Washington, D.C. at the Birchmere. She said, well, I wrote this song. And she starts playing it, and the guy goes, well, we've got to all start over to match up to that. And so I don't think you write something like that because you want to get on the radio, or or even that you want to make money. You only write something like that because it's just in you and it's got to get out. And then it's our job to try to shape it in a way to where we can make a living and keep working.
It seems to me that, Brian and Emmylou, what distinguished them from somebody like Graham or Townes, who really didn't care about country radio, that they were crafting records that would work there, and that it was important to them because they wanted to reach that audience, that they were, a lot of you guys were Southerners and you wanted to reach people who were like yourselves. And so it surely wasn't an accident that these records worked on country radio.
They work, but I don't think I think it's true when I say that we were just trying to make the best record of a particular song every time we tried to record it. And luckily, we had enough musical influences that we could land the recordings that we made somewhere within the realm of it could get played on the radio. And I think at that particular time, Columbia Records, the hierarchy at Nashville, Columbia, saw Rosanne as an innovative artist and were willing to put money behind it.
Did you find it surprising that you guys just made the records you felt you should make based on the songs and they became hits? I mean, was that surprising to you and Rosanne?
No, it wasn't surprising because babies needed diapers changed, and life was going on. And we were just making a living. And we had a family, and of course we wanted to be known for making good work, but life goes on in between recording sessions, and it's what you do in the in-between times that gets you to the next good song.
Geoffrey, one point in the book you describe, the music that Emmylou was making with Rodney, and then Rodney leaves, Ricky Skaggs comes in. What do you hear as the difference in what Emmylou was doing?
Well, part of it was that Emmy felt like there was whisperings in town in country music that, she was only having hits because she played Beatles songs. She wasn't really country, like the story you told with Conway Twitty's drummer. And she said, well, I'll show them. I'll do a real hardcore country record, which was Blue Kentucky Girl. And I think you were leaving about that time, and Ricky was coming in. Is that right?
But Blue Kentucky Girl was my contribution. Okay. But I'm going to own that one. It's like, Emmy, you got to record this song, and she did.
And then after they had done that, and sort of proved their bona fides, as it were. And then so let's go one step further into bluegrass, because Emmy had known the seldom seen country gentlemen guys out in Washington. So that was part of her background too. And because Brian came out of that Scottish, Nova Scotia, East Canada scene, which is another kind of string band music. So they were both interested in that. So, and then, they needed somebody who knew how those harmonies worked. And so they brought Ricky in. Now, Ricky is, to my mind, he's very much a part of this group, but he's sort of an outlier in a lot of ways, because he's very conservative religiously, he's very conservative politically, but at the same time, he was very radical musically, which is one of the sort of strange paradoxes of his career. And he taught, I think, Brian and Emmy a lot about the sort of classic bluegrass kind of construction techniques, but they taught him how those acoustic instruments could live with a rhythm section, and that was his solo career. He took that and ran with it. And he always told me that he considered those hit records, he was always very insistent that those weren't bluegrass, those were country records in his mind. And he says, if you want to hear bluegrass, I'll play you some Bill Monroe and Flatt and Scruggs, but these are my country records. And then he went back to bluegrass, of course, later.
Rodney, was it any surprise to you that Ricky Skaggs and Emmylou got together to make music? Could you see that coming? Did you anticipate that was coming along the lines?
Yeah, it was. Ricky was so talented. It was like Ricky was like Vince Gill, just oozing talent and without limitation. And if it could be imagined, they could play it and they could sing it, and they were cut from two different personalities, but cut from a similar cloth in that there was no limitation to their musicality. So when Ricky replaced me in the hot band, it was a good choice for them, because now, all I was ever doing was writing songs and singing some harmony and plunking a little bit of guitar. I wasn't contributing near the amount of music that Ricky could contribute. So Emmy got a lot of bang out of Ricky. That she got good songs out of me, but on stage she got more out of Ricky.
Do you feel like in the studio, Ricky was actually influencing how those songs were arranged?
Well, certainly, but Ricky played on Rosanne's first album. I Couldn't Do Nothing Right. Ricky came up with that cha-cha rhythm that he started playing it, and I went, what's that?
And which song is this?
I Never Could Do Nothing Right. and it starts with this kind of cha-cha riff, da, 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 and it was Ricky playing it on the acoustic guitar. And I said, we start there, and that whole arrangement of that song, including the fiddles, da 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 da, that was all Ricky. Very creative, and he was just having fun at a recording session and said, "What do you think about this?" And that's the way it came to be. So for Emmy to get him in the band was a good move for her.
I think it's interesting. I had not looked at the credits to realize that he's on that first album of Rosanne's, and I guess you guys didn't continue to use him because he got to be too big a star, right?
But there was a lot of cross currents. I mean, this is one of the things that fascinated about this group of people was that there was, you're writing songs for each other, you're, contributing to each other's recording sessions instrumentally or, composing or singing. And, we don't want to over-romanticize it, but it was sort of like a Paris in the 20s kind of feel to it,
Got to go back to Brian Ahern because Ricky Skaggs or Richard Green, the fiddle player, or Amos Garrett, Mac Rabenak, Dr. John, Ry Cooter. This was more on my first album, but it crossed over. It's like Brian was the man who brought all of these creative individuals into the recording studio. And, he should be hats off to Brian because he was, who was it used to say, I'm the one who stirs the drink, with O.J. Simpson or somebody like that. It's like Brian was the man who was stirring the drink because he put everybody together. He brought Ricky to L.A.
Did you sense a change in Emmylou's sound after Brian was no longer producing her? Or had she sort of so absorbed the Brian Ahern style that it seemed seamless to you once he was no longer producing?
Well, there's a natural arc to creativity and partnerships that, they start somewhere and then they come to fruition, and who knows how long that fruition lasts, and then it ebbs away and something else happens. It was, God, Emmy and Brian probably made 7 records or so that stand out as that particular collaboration, and you throw in a couple of mine and some of the Rosanne records that we made there. And there were a few other records made around. Jonathan Edwards made a record up at Enactron Truck. There were others. But it's only natural that, when I came to Nashville, I started recording with Tony Brown. The sound of the records I was making changed with Tony. So it's only natural. Creative partnerships or creative working relationships. It's like human beings. Different human beings get together, it becomes a different thing.
I'm wondering, with this movement that we've talked about here, what are ways in which things, Geoffrey, that we hear in this movement have persisted to this day?
I think it has a continuing influence. That there's still people making this sort of modern marriage music from country, and what changed was in the early '90s. Most of the people in this what we've been talking about were dropping off of country radio to one extent or another. And then Garth came through and sort of wiped the slate clean of everything. And all these people in the 90s reinvented themselves and made sort of art country rock records that were, weren't aimed at singles on the radio anymore, but were, like Wrecking Ball by Emmy and The Wheel that Rosanne did with John and, Houston Kid that you did. It was great work, some of the best work that they did, but it was not on country radio anymore. So it's persisted, I can rattle off some names, Lyle Lovett, I think this is sympathetic. Patty Loveless, of course, very much, she was married to Emery Gordy, who sort of amplifies this in-law theme. Buddy and Julie Miller is the perfect example of what we've been talking about, using their marriage as material for great songs, great recordings. The Dixie Chicks, you have sisters, and they were married to other singers, but they're also, making music very similar to this, high quality songs, high quality recordings. I think that what has changed in country music now is that there used to be a joke in Nashville, what is alt country? And the punchline was, it's country music that doesn't sell. And which
became Americana.
Yeah, it became Americana. And there was a kernel of truth to that, but if you look at it more critically, it's not really true anymore. If you look at, Jason Isbell, Old Crow Medicine Show, Margot Price, Charlie Crockett, these people can sell out the Ryman 2 or 3 nights in a row. They can have #1 country albums, but they can't get on country radio. So they're having commercial success, they're having artistic success, they're just not on the country radio. And so if you, that aside, they're doing very much what you were doing, I would argue.
Good on them.
Rodney, are there artists who have come along since your time with Emmylou and Rosanne and that whole bunch? Have there been artists that have come along, singer-songwriters, that you feel like are kind of moving in the footsteps of all of you? Is there anybody come to mind? I mean, Geoffrey was mentioning some people.
Well, Geoffrey just mentioned several, yeah. Yeah, there will always be. I made a record with a Texas boy named Vincent Neil Emerson, and he's the real deal. And what he wanted to do, and what I was happy to help him do, was exactly what I should have done on the second Guy Clark album that I produced. And I got to fix something with, and Vincent and I talked about this. I said, I made a mistake on a real mistake on a Guy Clark album, and you can help me fix it because you're the guy who is going to do, who can step into that. And I wasn't trying to make him like Guy Clark. It was just a way to produce a singer-songwriter without drums and with an acoustic ensemble around him, and have it all be live in the studio. Because to record basic tracks with Guy and then have him come back and sing after the fact was wrong.
That was the mistake.
That was a big mistake, and Guy was mad at me for a long time. The first record we made out of necessity, because he had used up all of his budget to make a record in Texas he didn't like, so he came to LA and we made South Coast of Texas on a shoestring budget. So the methodology that we had for making Rosanne and Emmylou records, we plugged Guy into that, and it worked because it had to. But later on, Guy had those great songs for Better Days, and I put him in a situation where we were still recording in the old way when it was time to to move into another area, and I didn't see it. And he knew it needed to happen, and it was a mistake I got to correct. I'm off track here, but
Let me ask you this. One of the things in this book that I write about is that, you left Emmy's band, you made your first solo album and a couple more, and you were writing songs that other people were covering and having hits with, but you weren't having hits yourself. And then you got really, when Rosanne started having hits, you got a lot of production offers, and you were working a lot as a producer. And you told me that you liked that, but you didn't want to give up on your own career, right? And during that period, two questions. What are the production projects we were particularly proud of, like Mary Kay Place and Bobby Bear and a couple others? And what made you give up something you were succeeding at to go back to recording, pushing your own career?
Bobby Bear, that record was a joy. 7 Year Ache, well, it stands for what it is, and the Bobby Bear record. But I'm a better songwriter than I am a producer. And if I stopped writing songs, I'd probably be a pretty good producer. But my heart lies in writing songs. And it is what I want to do, continue. It is what I continue. A writing period, it held more, it was more adventurous for me than I still produce the odd record now and again. It's fun. But writing is my job in life. I don't know if that should answer that question, I think.
What was it that brought you and Tony Brown together to do that Diamonds and Dirt album? How did that come about?
Well, Tony came into the hot band after I left, but I was in a position to open a lot of shows for Emmy and the hot band. So Tony and I got to know each other well, and Tony played on those early Rosanne records as well. So we were good friends, and Tony was at MCA and with the Jimmy Bowen era, and Tony was coming up with Jimmy Bowen, and we kind of went outlaw and said, Tony, you come produce my record for Columbia to see what Jimmy Bowen
special
says.
deal did Tony have to cut with Bowen to get
Oh,
free
well,
to do that?
it was a long, drawn-out affair, and Bowen said, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't risk your career on this guy who he writes hit songs, but he doesn't make any hit records. And Tony went and did it, and then we had 5 number ones songs off of that record, and it validated Tony, and Jimmy Bowen had to eat crow on that one.
Geoffrey, we've talked a lot about the era that you cover in this book. What have we not touched on that you'd really like to get out?
Well, one thing we did touch on this, but those when you first came to town with your cousin Donovan, and ended up on West End Avenue and Bishop's Pub, and going to those parties at Guy, and Steve was around, and a bunch of other, Richard Dobson and Susanna and Towns and Mickey Newbury. What was so special about that scene when none of you were having particular success, but that sort of planted the seeds for what was to come?
When I think back on that, Richard Dobson was always, he had the Hemingway elbow patches on his, and he was saying, "This is Paris in the 20s." Well, yeah, we're all, artists, and none of us have any money. I think the romantic thing that I go back to, I think, if I know what you're asking, is that it was never about money. It was, I don't think any of us at that particular, 3 a.m., and the first time you heard Please Come to Boston, Dave Loggins sing that, or Towns sing Pancho and Lefty for the first time, and over on Harlan Avenue in the house that it wasn't about, oh, that's going to be a hit and make anybody any money. It was like, wow, how do I do that? How do I find a way to do that? And that was the guiding factor. Is just I want to write a song as good as Pancho and Lefty.
And when was the first time you got like a nod of approval from those guys?
Bluebird Wine.
Bluebird Wine.
Guy. And then, but not Towns. I didn't get a nod from Towns until he heard Till I Gain Control Again. And then it was like, good song.
And how did Emmylou get Bluebird Wine? How did that connection happen?
There was a bass player in Anne Murray's band, Brian produced Anne Murray, named Skip Beckwith, Nova Scotian, great guy. He came through Nashville looking for a guitar player to take the place of Lenny Breau in Anne Murray's band. And there was a guy named Bob Cardwell who was hanging around in this little apartment I had on Harlan Avenue. And Bob Cardwell, he had his audition with Skip Beckwith at that little apartment I had over there. And when that was done and Cardwell got the job, Skip turned to me and said, "You write songs, right?" And he said, "You got any songs?" He said, "I'm going back to Toronto. Got anything for Anne Murray?" And I said, And I gave him, Emmy remembers it, a cassette, but I think it was a reel-to-reel with Bluebird Wine, Until I Gain Control Again on it. Song for the Life. Every song on that reel became a hit. And he took it to Brian in Toronto, and according to Emmy, I saw Emmy last night, and that Emmy had heard all these songs all day long and hadn't heard anything she liked. And Brian said, "Well, I got this one last thing that this bass player brought. I haven't listened to it. Let's see what's in it." That's Emmy's version of it. And they opened it up, and Bluebird Wine was the first song, and she said, "Bingo, that's it."
And didn't that tape and Emmy hearing your songs directly lead her to pull you in and pull you into the band?
Yeah.
What was in it for you when she said join? I mean,
Well,
you're here. You are a singer. You're a singer
I'm still
songwriter.
asking that question. What's in it for me?
No. You're a singer. You're a singer songwriter. You know, I'm sure you wanted to be an artist. He's like, "Yeah, I'll join this band instead."
With this, I can tell a music business insider story.
Yeah.
I went to Toronto after this, and I met Emmy in Washington, but we bounced up to Toronto, and we hit it off, and I knew that Emmy and I were going to be good friends, and we were probably going to collaborate. So I was writing songs for Jerry Reed's publishing company. There's a guy named Harry Warner, sweetheart guy who ran Jerry's business. So I come back to Nashville, and I go see Harry. I said, "Hey, Harry, I met this singer up in Toronto. She's great. I think she's really going to do some things." And I said, "Can I get some of my songs back from Jerry's publishing company?" Which would never happen today. And Harry said, "Sure, which ones do you want?" And I said, "Well, I want An American Dream, and I want Song for the Life. I want Bluebird Wine, I want Till I Gain Control Again, and I want I Ain't Living Long Like This." And he said, "They're yours."
Wow.
That wouldn't happen today. No way it would happen today.
Talk a little bit about the Guy and Susanna and Towns, and how they're like a half a generation older than you guys, and how they were both mentors and colleagues, and Guy had a recording career, and had one top 40 hit himself, but wrote a lot of country hits, and he and Townes were like great friends, but they were very different approaches to their careers. And Susanna had actively avoided having a career. And
Susanna.
yeah.
She was a muse.
Uh-huh.
She was the central muse because, I mean, the boys were competitive. We're all competitive. It's good, the competition to write something really good. And the older guys had the leg up, but for me, I wanted Susanna's approval. And I started aiming my songs at Susanna. And she was invaluable that way, because if she would even lift an eyelid with one of your songs, you were getting close to going somewhere. The guys would be, it's like, it's just macho business as usual, but Suzanne.
She was quite a writer herself.
Oh, great writer. But she had no aspirations. She was a painter as well.
Right.
So she was an artist in the truest sense, I suppose. She'd write really great songs, but if they got recorded, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And to play her a song that would move her, and she became a real champion of mine, getting my songs to Willie Nelson and what have you.
And Guy was, he always hated the term craftsman, but it did, reveal something about him, that he was much more, he really worked at refining those songs, and, what he called the keepers, and the ones you throw back in the pond to grow a little more, and whereas Townes seemed more intuitive, and things would happen in a burst. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, Townes was tapped into something really magical. To this day, Guy is the best self-editor I've ever encountered, and I modeled my work ethic a lot after Guy, because I consciously started working at self-editing, figuring out that, see, Guy, there'd be a line come in a song that you're working on, or sometimes we worked on, it'd be like a line that somebody would stake their career on, and Guy would go, no, it doesn't work. Doesn't work. I said, well, why doesn't it work? He says, because it has nothing to do with the narrative. It's just glitter. And that stuck with me. Those two right there were, I wouldn't be the songwriter I am today, or I have been, if I hadn't lucked into being really close with them.
Was there any jealousy or envy among the males of your group, that even though Susanna didn't concentrate on songwriting, it seemed like she would effortlessly turn out hits? She'd write something like "Easy from Now On," like, boom,
Jealousy?
Was there?
Yeah, there was jealousy. I mean, they're human beings. And we were all jealous of whoever got the most of Susanna's attention. Guy seemed to roll with it pretty well, but at some point he'd lop it off. But it was, the first time I heard Pancho and Lefty sitting this close to Townes, I was jealous. You bet your butt. God, what I wouldn't give to write a song like that.
Did Townes know how revered he was among your
Yes.
crowd? Oh, he was aware. Okay.
He dined out on it.
Yeah, one of the things I make the point of in the book is that, Townes was a profound influence on this group of people. There's no debate about that. But I don't consider him an in-law artist because he didn't tried to connect with the country audience in the way that you guys did. That there was not a, part of what made the In-Law Country group who they were was they wanted to be on country radio. They wanted to connect to a country audience. They wanted to have careers, and Townes was willing to like ride his horse over the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it would have messed up his groove to be a star.
Yeah.
He's the one who said, right, there are two kinds of music, the blues and zippity-doo-dah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with zippity-doo-dah.
Well, we're coming close to the close. Is there anything, Rodney, you'd like to say about this era that Geoffrey covered and this whole idea of a movement that you and your friends were part of?
Well, yeah. I think there's a thing about Emmylou Harris that we all love. And it can be hard to define, but she inspired idealism, an ideal, but she was a champion of everybody else. She wanted to see everybody else succeed. I don't know. I mean, at times, Emmy could express a little frustration out the side of her mouth, but for the most part, there was a purity in the way she approached being an artist and being a interpreter of songs and being a writer of songs it really set the tone. And it was spiritual. Truly, I think something really deeply spiritual in Emmylou that it's almost like you got a fire going, you want to stand around and warm your hands around it. But the fire to come in from the cold, that was Emmylou. She was a flame that you wanted to warm your hands around. And it's hard not to love Emmylou. And I think love is the very thing that we're really talking about. The love of this music, the love of creating, the love of sharing moment to creativity in a moment-to-moment sequence is a blessing that I'll be forever grateful for.
I think that, when I was trying to define this group and, try to explain how interconnected it was, Emmylou was like the spoke, the hub of all the spokes that radiated out in this group. And everything sort of came through Emmylou. And that, even though she didn't write many songs, she had amazing gift for picking songs, and inhabiting them when she recorded them. And she recorded songs, by you and your peers, but she also sang classic country songs, the Louvre Brothers, the Lynn's,
Kitty Wells.
Merle. And one of the things that I say in the book is that sometimes in culture, the most radical thing you can do is go backwards into the past and find something that articulates what you're trying to say now. And the old can become the new, radical new in a very mysterious way, especially, and I think that's what this group, especially Emmylou, because she was, because she didn't write the majority of her songs. She was like finding the songs that projected this vision, and by pulling from the past and intermingling it with what was happening right now, she created something new, in a very, sort of mind-boggling way, I think.
I'm wondering, Rodney, was there ever any resistance among the group, when Emmylou wanted to do these older country songs from 10, 20 years earlier? Was there any resistance from Brian Ahern or you or anyone saying, no, let's not do that old thing, let's do something new? Or did everybody embrace it?
I don't remember that ever happening. Pretty much impeccable choice of material, really. It occurred to me when you were talking, Geoffrey, that although Emmy did not write a lot of songs, she's written her share, but she had the poet's soul, and she was always operating from it. As an interpreter of song, she was operating from the poet's soul.
Yeah, and I think that interpretive singing is as valid an art form as singer-songwriter. I mean, if it doesn't really matter how you create that connection with an audience member, it's whether or not you can do it. I think that one other thing I wanted to mention was that, Rosanne, she always talks about herself as a songwriter, and she's obviously a very good songwriter. But on those early records, she was writing a minority of the songs, and I've always felt that she herself underestimated what an effective singer she was. That sort of the tone and the sort of intense ambivalence that she brought to some of those songs. And you worked with her in the studio. What was it about her singing voice as opposed to the other parts of her creativity that really were so...
Loved her singing voice. Truly. I think probably before I fell in love with her, I was in love with her voice. It's a particular tone that got to work with a lot. And, for a period of time, a great voice. Bobby Bear described it. We made a duet early on, Bobby Bear. No Memories Hanging Around.
Right.
Duet, and Bobby comes in, he listened, and he hadn't really heard her, and he goes, oh, she has one of those wet voices. And I said, what do you mean by wet voices? He said, it would sound just as good underwater as it would above.
I'll tell you that back in January, Rosanne did a program here in this theater, because we now have an exhibit on Rosanne that's up on the third floor. I hope you guys will see it. It's in the museum. And Rosanne said during the interview with R.J. Smith that she felt insecure about her voice at first as an artist, because her model was Emmylou Harris. She looked up to Emmylou in many ways, and she felt like, oh, Emmy has this crystalline soprano voice, and my voice is lower, and I don't know. She did say during the program, she's grown accustomed to her voice, she's fine with her voice, but Emmylou was her model.
Good model.
Yeah. Anything more you'd like to say, Geoffrey?
Well, we're going to be signing some books, so you can buy the books up in that corner, and then we'll sign them up in that corner, just outside the auditorium. And I want to thank Rodney for coming out and sharing these stories.
I want to thank both of you for coming out. This has been a lovely program. Everybody give them a hand.